Bud Light has started an ad campaign with Dylan Mulvaney. If people don't already know who Dylan Mulvaney is, he's basically outrage bait. So he started his career in acting. He's a male. He's transitioned into a female. And what he did was he tried a bunch of different things, was not successful. He ended up getting to this trans movement and identifying as a woman and talking about girlhood and all these these are actions and activities that girls would never do, things that girls would never say, but he would post it on his TikTok, and that's how he got a lot of attention. Then companies took notice of him, and now you have companies like Bud Light, who is starting a campaign with him where he got a bottle with his face on it, and this is going out to his TikTok followers, who are a much younger, more impressionable audience. So the question is, why is Bud Light doing this? Well, if we look into Bud Light and the representation behind the company, we have the vice president, who is a woman who has been indoctrinated. Now, let me preface this. How do these people in companies, even how we would think more conservative companies, or rather companies who would target a more conservative person, like truck drivers, males who just want to watch the game, that type of demographic. There are people who come up through the high school, let's say public school, but also private school, mostly public school, but high school, and then the universities. When they go through academia, they're indoctrinated and being hit with all this type of information. A lot of this information is really propaganda about feminism, about how society is structured, how there's a fabrication in the structuring of societal norms, and how biology doesn't really exist. It's more of a construction of our minds and how we perceive things. And so these people end up graduating college, they end up, turning 25, 30 years old, and they apply to different companies, and some of these companies are Bud Light. Then when they get into these companies, they rise up the ranks, and they're now in charge of distributing information or distributing market campaigns. And when they have the ideology that they've adopted through the education system when they were an impressionable young mind, and especially if you're a girl, you think more emotionally, so you're going to be more impressionable from an emotional point of view. Now you're in charge of these companies to an extent where you're funding campaigns with Dylan Mulvaney. Now, this in itself is not necessarily objectively good or bad, in a sense that companies can do whatever they want. But we have to identify what's going on here. We have a company whose main demographic is not the demographic that's being targeted here, right? So the demographic here is younger children and trans people, or people within the LGBT community. This VP had said that Bud Light needs to target these demographics, otherwise Bud Light is going to go out of business. They're going to lose revenue. They're going to lose an audience. Bud Light is actually one of the most popular brands in America. It's cheap, light beer, and it's connected to Anheuser-Busch, so they have a bunch of other products. So the very fact that she's saying they have to go after these other demographics, it's just plainly false, right? But they want to go after these demographics because it's an ideological push. So you have to go after the LGBT community. Sure, maybe you want to gain more of an audience, but it's what you're doing is you're now, because your main demographic is a certain type of person, let's say a more conservative person, even though they may not be politically involved, you are now being condescending and being demeaning to these people, the major part of your demographic, in an effort to appease the 1% of your demographic, or the 1% of the population that you're trying to reach to include into your demographic. Then you're also trying to reach young, impressionable kids. Now, the drinking age in America is 21. It's different in all the other nations. We generally don't want, now, our brains are still developing, up until the point of age 24 to 27. It really depends on the individual. So 21 is even kind of young to be using a substance, although you're considered an adult, so you take on the risks and the rewards, if there are any rewards. And to be reaching a younger demographic, because this is going towards Dylan Mulvaney, whose primary platform is on TikTok. You have TikTok skews at the youngest audience for demographic, right? So there's Snapchat, TikTok, that's like in the same category. Then you move above that, you have Instagram, move above that, you have Twitter, and then you got the old folks on Facebook, right? So every social media platform has its layering of audience. So when you're targeting younger kids, you're purposely, intentionally going after a younger demographic who's impressionable, whose brains haven't been developed, and that is an ethical issue, right? The same thing with LGBT, in the sense of you're demonizing most of your audience for 1% of the population. We saw this with the Gillette commercial, I don't know how long ago, it was a few years ago, where Gillette is used by men, the razor company, and then they came out with a trans commercial, which is basically demonizing the core of your demographic. And a lot of men won't use Gillette anymore. And even with this Bud Light example, they've lost $4 to $5 billion worth of market cap just within the span of a couple weeks. Now, that could obviously go back up. And Bud Light is not necessarily a growth company in terms of the stock market world, but there's negative repercussions to your improper actions when you're basing it off of an ideology that does not serve the best interests of individuals. That's very subjective, but you can look at objective metrics to contribute to that subjective reasoning. Now, what do you do in situations like this? Well, first and foremost, you don't have to stop drinking beer. I mean, if you drink beer, first off, just know that there are a lot of chemicals in beer that is not conducive towards you, especially if you're a male. It can mimic estrogen, and so you're essentially decreasing your testosterone over time, unnecessary calories. But let's say you want to have a drink every now and then, you drink responsibly, fine. While there's other beer out there, you have to keep in mind that this is still part of Anheuser-Busch. So there are going to be a lot of other brands that are under that holding company. And a lot of people may not do their due diligence to say, oh, I want to boycott Bud Light, but instead you're getting another product from the same major holding company. So people can boycott with their actions, with their dollar, and with their voice. Now, this is not a blatant infringement of rights. This is just a company that is taking a type of action. But this is in tandem with a lot of other companies out there who have been financially and ideologically compromised. So, for example, we have a lot of companies that are joining this ESG movement, environmental, social governance. Now, what that is it's basically a credit score for companies that are at the helm of bigger, larger institutions like bigger hedge funds, BlackRock. There are other hedge funds like that. I believe Vanguard actually just pulled out of the ESG, but they were a big institution who was part of it initially. And so these companies now have to submit to the ideology of ESG, which is not really about the environment, because if you look at, for example, Tesla and ExxonMobil has a higher ESG score than Tesla, even though Tesla is for renewable energy and ExxonMobil is for non-renewable energy. But ExxonMobil goes with the ideology, and they also pay carbon credits. So carbon credits are, okay, you're spewing X amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, or you have a certain amount of waste. You pay to purchase carbon credits, and you use those carbon credits to offset your waste. Those carbon credits theoretically are used by government to fund projects that are supposed to help the environment. If you look into it, there's a lot of issues with that. Anyways, to simplify it, the ESG type of credit system is just a method of control. So think of the social credit system in China. It's not necessarily to make sure that citizens are good Samaritans, but to make sure that every citizen is in line with the CCP and their ideology. If you go out of line, you can't travel, you can't go outside to different cities, you can't go to certain areas. And so it's a restriction movement, restriction on movement if you're not submitting to a certain narrative, certain ideology, certain belief system, and that translates into culture and into law, right? Because if you get enough people who are part of this, that becomes culture. You get enough people who are part of it culturally, that's now public sentiment. Now you can pass policy, and now there's repercussions if you infringe on that cultural boundary. So when we look at these companies, it's not just that, okay, we look at Bud Light, we didn't think this could happen, because there are other beer companies who are doing, let's say, Pride stuff, right? A month of June, they do Pride stuff. And funny enough, they only do it here in America. They don't do it anywhere else. But that's because they acknowledge that in other countries, they can't play the same game, because most of these other countries are not liberal. They're not heavily progressive. In fact, they're very conservative. Like in the Middle East or in Asia, they're very conservative when it comes to the ideology and their cultural imprint that they want to put onto their population. So what we need to do in situations like this, when we have Bud Light, is, okay, you have other options, but we also need to be aware that this is the initiation of their cultural movement to take corporations who, it would seem like we have a lot of consumer choice. So if one company goes awry, well, there are other options. But once you get a conglomeration of these corporations working together, and they're all spouting the same ideology, and they're all going after younger kids, and they're forsaking their target demographic, and they're going after a small percentage of the population, and maybe they can do that because they're subsidized by different institutions, or maybe potentially even government. Well, now it's not about financial means. It's not about the bottom line. It's not about your shareholders. It's not about people who have a stake in the company. It's about the ideological motive in a world where we have centralized governments who are printing money left and right, they're passing these huge trillion-dollar bills. The Federal Reserve has to back up these bills by putting money into the system. Then the banks are given leeway and leverage to take 10% of their deposits and have 100 times the amount of money in the system. Like they fabricate money 100 times more than what they have in deposits. You now have essentially unlimited money. They still have to gauge it and meter it because they want to make sure that the system still operates in a sense, in a way where they can still benefit. Because if you just print unlimited amounts of money, well, even if you're at the top, you're an elite, and you have all this cash, and it becomes infinite, it doesn't mean anything, right? So you have to still make it mean something. You have to have the trust from the people into these centralized systems for the money to mean something. But they can print an exorbitant amount of the cash, and they can take this cash and they can fund these corporations, fund different institutions. And now it just becomes about ideology, because these companies don't have to worry about money. They don't have to worry about being financed. They can get subsidized by the federal government. We know that the EV industry right now is being heavily subsidized by the federal government. And funny enough, Tesla is being kicked out of this EV initiative. So even though it's the biggest EV manufacturer, it's the farthest out of any EV manufacturer in terms of data, in terms of actual progression towards having autonomous vehicles that can fully rely on battery power and multiple charging stations around the nation that connect with each other. Because the Biden administration doesn't like Elon Musk, because Elon Musk is, let's say, outside, he's an outcast from the establishment, his company, which is theoretically supposed to align with this current administration, is seen as something that is a black sheep. And so they don't try to fund it. They don't try to include them in certain environmental initiatives or meetings, summits. But they take all these other manufacturers like GM, Chevrolet, all these other manufacturers, and they subsidize those companies within that industry. And so a lot of these companies don't have to worry about, are they going to be able to sell their cars? Are they going to be able to make a huge amount of profit? Because you have government coming in and helping them out. And the government is really just using our taxpayer money to help them out. So we are indirectly helping companies. So this is a way where government can get into our business, or people want power, control, wealth, influence. They can go to government, which would help pass political policy and have executive force, and or they can also go to corporations. When you have corporations working with governments and you have these people who are these are all just people. This is fascism when you have corporations and governments working together. Instead of going into government and the government directly going after you, which they do anyways, they'll go into a corporation, they'll siphon taxpayer money by having the government subsidize their company, their corporation. Then they'll use their corporation to pass their ideological agendas. And they will get enough players on the board to come together to consolidate, to have enough control over your consumer choice. And so it's kind of like a big loophole, although it's not really a loophole, but it's kind of like a big loophole. And well, not a loophole, it's a way to circumvent the system so it doesn't look like government is directly going after you. But government directly goes after you anyways. We've seen unconstitutional executive orders just within the past 5 years, just within this current administration. So there's a lot here to unpack. What we need to understand, what we need to do really is know that there's a consolidation of companies who want to remove your consumer choice. They, at the end of the day, they care about profit. There's a lot of people who care about profit because they need to make a living. But if they can get their money from somewhere else and they can ideologically push their agenda, because at the very top of these classes, at the very top of these corporations and governments, these people have enough money. They have enough money to last them lifetimes. They have all the access to resources, not because they have to use their money necessarily, but because they can use taxpayer money or corporation money. And that's how they can get their private jets. That's how they can fund their lifestyle. So they don't even necessarily have to use their own money. These people don't care about money. Then they care about how can we push our worldview, whatever they have in their mind, whatever they want to push onto the world, whatever they want the world to adopt. And usually it's to serve their self-interest, right? It's never really 99% of the time to make sure that the world becomes a better place so that people have individual rights, they can defend themselves, they can speak freely, they can build something, they can compete in the marketplace. It's almost never about that. They have everything that they ever need. They don't have to think about survival. So what they think about is, how can I have more dominion on this world? This shouldn't be anything new to people. I mean, this is not, we've been watching TV shows and movies for the longest time. So even if you're not politically affluent, if you just look at media, there's always a villain. The villain always wants to conquer territory, resources, people, minds, whatever it is. And they're always using new technology to do it. And they're trying to find ways to do it to get around the good guys, right? So you have good guys who will come in and they will find these ways that the bad guys are circumventing the system to have more control. That's always the same type of story. That's the same type of story because it comes from somewhere. It comes from the human innate ideology to conquer. And so we have to be aware of that. Just know that this is the stepping stone to what is coming to other companies. We've already seen it with other companies, but just the fact that now an entire company does not care about its demographic and they're going after the 1% of their demographic and they're going towards a younger demographic shows us just how far this needle is getting pushed. Now, generally, companies have to adapt to the marketplace. If people are not buying their beers, they're not buying their products, their goods or services, then they have to change their good product or service to adapt to the marketplace. But like I said, if they're getting subsidized in some way, or they don't have to worry about financial motives, they can just focus on their ideology, it really doesn't matter.